Have you ever wondered what really happens when your heart stops? Not in a poetic sense, not as metaphor, but as real as skin-cooling lungs still, and everything you once called, you dissolving into something else entirely. That's what happened to me. My name is Isla Monroe, and I died in the middle of an ordinary day on a bus with the sun too bright and my body too tired. But that was just the beginning. What I discovered on the other side of my near-death experience didn't just change my understanding of life, it unraveled. It reshaped it and handed me back something far more powerful than I had before. It started like this. I wasn't reckless, not by any means. I was the quiet kind. The girl in scarves and notebooks in the corners of classrooms, the one teachers remembered for neat handwriting, not bold answers. I had lived 17 years in Anchorage, Alaska, beneath skies that taught you to stay small and quiet and safe. So when I was awarded a full scholarship for a student exchange program in Lisbon, it wasn't just a trip, it was a revolution. I had never seen the ocean, and now I was flying across it. But by the time we landed, my body was losing the fight. 2 layovers, no sleep, jet lag, clinging to every thought like fog. I was barely there. My eyelids threatened collapse. My limbs ached like I had been unstitched and hastily sewn back together. I needed clarity, energy. I needed to show up. So when my roommate handed me a bottle of caffeine pills with a wink and said, "You'll feel like a superhero," I didn't hesitate. 2 before breakfast, 2 before the tour bus, 1 more after lunch. That last one is the only one I truly remember. It began with a vibration in my chest, subtle, not painful but strange, like a distant hum under my ribs too deep to name. Then my hands began to tingle, my toes curled on their own, my legs bounced without command. The chaperone's voice faded into a haze. The streets outside the bus smeared into light and motion. Then my heart began to pound, not beat, but hammer like a war drum, echoing up into my skull. I tried to calm it. I tried to breathe deeply, but the world spun. The light screamed and my vision narrowed into tunnel and blur. Then everything simply stopped. No impact, no scream, just nothing. Silence, stillness. And then I was no longer in my body. I was above it, watching, floating in air that didn't hold me and time that didn't move. I looked down and saw myself the girl I had always believed. I was slumped slightly forward, strands of hair falling across my cheek, hands resting loosely in my lap, still and silent. But I was still here, still thinking, still perceiving, still feeling. The silence wasn't absence. It was presence. It filled the space like breath held across the entire universe. Everything was still, but everything was alive. I could see in all directions, forward, behind, beneath, above. The bus glowed faintly, as if saturated with its own memories. The handrails pulsed with past emotions, joy, sorrow, frustration etched into the metal like fingerprints made of feeling. The people around me no longer looked like people. They looked like energy fields, soft outlines of light vibrating at different speeds. The girl across from me flickered orange with nervous energy. The guide glimmered dull and restless, but no one noticed. No one saw that I was gone. And I didn't feel fear, not once, not for a second. I felt wonder. I felt awe. I had always believed my body was me, that my skin and my breath and my voice were where I began and ended. But there I was, completely whole, completely present, completely myself, and my body sitting there lifeless was just clothing I had stepped out of. Then I felt it. Not a sound, not a sight, a presence. It didn't appear because it had always been there. It didn't speak, but I understood it. It didn't pull, but I moved toward it. It was like gravity woven from softness, an invitation written in silence. Come. And I did. Without moving, I arrived elsewhere. The bus was gone. The city, the air, the heat, all gone. I floated in a space without color or walls or boundaries. It wasn't dark. It wasn't light. It was a whiteness that was not visual, but emotional. A purity that held me like I had never been held. I didn't have a body. I didn't have thoughts and words. I had awareness, raw, radiant, limitless. And I knew absolutely without question that I was not alone. The presence followed me not as a separate being, but as a layer of myself I had always ignored. It didn't look like anything. It didn't sound like anything, but I recognized it. Not like meeting someone for the first time, but like returning to someone I had missed without knowing. It had been there behind every dream, beneath every instinct, waiting patiently. This was not a god. This was not a being. This was a remembering. I remembered what I was before I was born. I remembered that this was home. Not forward, not backward, just home. And then time, or whatever remained of it, began to stretch. I didn't see memories. I saw truths. I saw how, every time I held my tongue out of fear, a piece of me folded inward. How every smile I wore for approval dulled something sacred inside. How every moment I doubted myself was a doorway I refused to walk through. But there was no blame, no shame, just light, understanding. I wasn't being judged. I was being witnessed. I could have stayed. I wanted to stay. But something shifted, not in me, around me, like a current turning, a soft awareness that I had touched what I needed to touch, that my time there for now was done. The presence didn't push me away, it simply stopped holding me. And in that loosening, I felt the thread of my body begin to tug, a faint beat, a far-off breath, the density of life calling me back. The light didn't vanish, it condensed, became heavier, slower. I felt form again, edges, resistance, gravity. I felt small. I felt separate. I felt like I was being poured back into a vessel too tight for what I had just become. But even as sensation returned, even as my heart restarted, even as breath scratched at my throat, I knew. This wasn't a mistake. I wasn't being punished. I was being chosen. Or perhaps I had chosen. My near-death experience wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of everything. The whiteness began to fade, not into darkness, but into weight. The space I had floated in, unbound and eternal, began to thicken around me like water, slowly turning to honey. The presence that had once held me with such vast gentleness now began to step back, not in abandonment, but in trust, as if it knew the lesson had settled and the return had already been chosen. I didn't feel pushed. I didn't feel commanded. It was more like a subtle knowing passed through my soul, soft as breath. This was the threshold, and I had already agreed to cross it. I wasn't being sent back. I was being returned by my own design. The formless expanse, that luminous realm where thought wasn't needed and love was the natural atmosphere, began to dim in density. My awareness, once spread across everything, began to gather inward. I could feel the form waiting for me like a heavy coat I'd left behind. My body, it was still there, still warm enough to take me back, but no longer familiar. The moment I started folding into it, I understood the cost of incarnation. Here, everything had edges. Here, every movement would require effort. Breath wouldn't just be, it would be drawn. Time wouldn't just unfold, it would tick, demand, divide. And yet this was the world I was re-entering, not because I had to, because I had already chosen to. As I slipped downward, sensation returned slowly like waves lapping at the edges of forgotten land. I felt heat. I felt the pressure of lungs clenching as if remembering their role. I felt pain not stabbing, but deep and echoing like the ache of muscles, waking after long stillness. My chest tightened, a ringing filled my ears. My limbs began to buzz with static. It was disorienting. I hadn't been gone for long, and yet everything in this body felt foreign, like I was wearing someone else's skin. I wasn't sure how to move. I wasn't sure I wanted to. Somewhere distant, I heard the sound of tires humming over cobblestones, a burst of laughter, the low mechanical hum of the bus's air conditioner. The world hadn't paused when I left. No one had noticed. My body had fallen into stillness quietly, and now it was stirring again with the same quiet. It felt surreal, like I had just been born, except I remembered everything from before. My fingers twitched, my throat scratched, my breath returned in shallow, hesitant waves, not as life-giving force, but as obligation. I didn't open my eyes at first. I didn't want to. I hovered at the edge, not fully in the body, not fully out, like slipping back into a dream that no longer fits. When I finally dared to look, the world was blurred, smeared like wet paint. Shapes shifted in front of me, seats, windows, shadows of people moving. I blinked once, twice, but my vision lagged behind reality. There was no panic, only stillness, an eerie stillness. I turned my head. Slightly muscles stiff, like they'd been unused for weeks. The girl next to me was scrolling through photos, completely unaware that I had just left life behind. Everything around me looked the same, but I knew I wasn't. The strange part was not how much had changed, but how little. That's what struck me hardest, that something so monumental could happen inside me, something so profound it shattered my understanding of reality, and yet the world moved on completely untouched. There was no applause, no radiant light, no witnesses, only my quiet return to a seat on a bus heart, fluttering like a nervous bird lungs relearning their rhythm. The near-death experience I had just endured, just embraced, felt impossibly far and painfully close at the same time. It had cracked something open in me, and now I was left to walk among people who hadn't seen the crack, people who hadn't even noticed I'd gone. There were no tears, no dramatic gasp, just silence, a different kind of silence now. Not the intelligent stillness of the white realm, but the hollow silence of re-entry. I sat blinking, trying to find myself in this flesh again. I looked at my hands, foreign, disconnected, like gloves I wasn't sure how to wear. I moved them slowly, experimentally. They obeyed, but I didn't feel like the one commanding them. My breath deepened, my shoulders ached, my feet tingled. Everything was registering again, but none of it felt right. That was the weight of returning. Not the heaviness of physicality alone, but the knowledge I now carried within me, a knowing that could never be unseen, never unlived. I had crossed over. I had seen the other side of the veil. And I had returned not because I had to, but because something in me had agreed that it wasn't time to stay. I still had something to do here, something unnamed, unformed, but it waited, like a spark in the distance, a seed I had yet to grow into. The bus rolled on, Lisbon streets blurred past the windows, sun glinting off stone and tile and iron. But I wasn't just sitting on a tour bus anymore. I was inhabiting a question. One I would carry with me quietly, gently, endlessly. Why me? Why return? What am I meant to remember that others have forgotten? No one had the answer, not even the presence. It had only shown me. It had not instructed me. This was my path to walk, and I would have to do so inside this body again. And so I sat, not as Isla who had left, but as Isla who had returned. And in that return, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel saved. I felt held by something vast and humbled by how invisible that holding had been to everyone around me. The world didn't know what had happened, but I did. And from that moment on, I would never live the same way again, because the breath in my chest was no longer ordinary. It was borrowed. It was chosen. It was sacred. I didn't speak for the rest of that day. My body moved as it was supposed to, step after step down cobbled streets into cathedrals and cafes and museums filled with relics of history. But I was no longer walking through Lisbon as a tourist. I was wandering through it like someone who had been plucked from existence and then quietly sewn back in a single thread, misaligned just enough to feel the world shift with every breath. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing felt the same. I could hear the voices of my classmates, see the flickers of sunlight on white walls, taste the sharp mineral tang of city air, but it all pressed against me like a dream I couldn't fully re-enter. My skin felt too small, as though I had grown beyond it in that other realm. My voice remained unused, not out of fear, but because I had no words for the vastness I carried inside. There was a thin veil between me and everything now, as if I had been placed just slightly out of sync with reality. I didn't belong to the rhythm anymore. I watched pigeons hold impossible stillness on opposite sides of a fountain, as if they too were holding their breath. I stared into the cracked shoulder of a statue and saw sorrow there that no one else seemed to notice. Every moment whispered softly but insistently, as if the world was trying to remind me of something I had seen but not fully understood. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but it never stopped. I didn't just feel changed, I felt split. Half of me still tethered to that place beyond the veil, half of me trying to pretend nothing had happened at all. The hardest part wasn't that no one noticed I had died. It was that I came back holding something so massive, so sacred, and there was nowhere to put it. I wanted to tell someone. I wanted to say I left my body. I saw through time. I met something older than the universe and more loving than anything words can hold. But how do you say that to someone scrolling through their phone or sipping coffee beside you? I imagined telling my mother, seeing her brows furrow in that familiar way, her lips parting with worry, and I couldn't bear to place this weight in her hands. So I didn't. I held it like a secret flame cupped in my palms, trembling with the responsibility of it. That night in the hotel room, I lay on my back for hours, staring at the ceiling as if it might thin and dissolve into that realm again. My roommate snored softly beside me, oblivious. I wasn't afraid to sleep, I was afraid of forgetting. Afraid that the light I had carried so vividly behind my eyes might fade into the blur of memory. I didn't want to lose it. I didn't want it to become just another strange story I told myself to feel special. It had been real, more real than any kiss, any bruise, any name I'd ever been called. It wasn't a dream, it was a return. And now I had to live in a world that would never quite reflect what I had seen. In the days that followed, my body began to readjust. I ate, I laughed at the right times, I even smiled in a few photographs, though the expression never reached the space behind my eyes. But inwardly, something had been rearranged. I began to see patterns, threads connecting people and places, and moments that had once seemed random. A child's laugh in a narrow alley stirred something ancient in me. A stranger's words echoed a dream I hadn't realized I remembered. Even the wind felt different, as if it were speaking a language I had always known but never paused to hear. I knew it would sound like madness if I said it aloud, but it wasn't madness. It was memory, deep memory, soul memory. The near-death experience hadn't gifted me new eyes. It had peeled away the veil that had been there all along. One afternoon, I sat alone in a quiet cafe beneath a sycamore tree, and I watched a line of ants cross the tiled floor in perfect unison. Their path was clear, their purpose unquestioned. I envied them. I no longer had the illusion of direction. I had seen too much but been told nothing. I had been given breath again but not a map, and yet something inside me whispered that the not knowing was part of the calling. That if I had returned with instructions, I might mistake them for limits. So instead, I walked forward with my senses wide open, following every small shimmer, every emotional echo, as if they were breadcrumbs leading me toward the life I had yet to remember I came here to live. That evening, while the group attended a performance in a crowded plaza, I slipped away. I followed an alley lit by hanging lanterns, their paper skins glowing softly like moons. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just knew I needed stillness, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was listening. The city thinned until I reached a dead-end wall. I didn't turn around. I simply sat down on the cold pavement, closed my eyes, and waited. Not for revelation, not for vision, just for silence. And in that stillness, I felt it again. Not the full force of the presence, not the brilliance of the white realm, but a shimmer, a brush against the edges of my perception, a whisper like breath. My heartbeat slowed, my shoulders softened, and then a sentence rose, not from thought, not from memory, but from knowing you are not here to escape the world. You are here to feel it fully. I didn't need more than that. It wasn't a command, it was a remembering. I opened my eyes and the lanterns above had shifted in the breeze. A woman passed at the far end of the alley, humming something I almost recognized. I stood, not hurried, not hesitant, and walked back toward the noise of the city, but I was no longer walking to catch up. I was walking to listen. I didn't know who I would become after this. I didn't know what I would do with what I had seen. But I knew the girl who had taken those pills to stay awake had awoken to something far more powerful than caffeine. She had touched the edge of eternity and returned not with answers, but with remembrance. And from that day forward, I would carry it quietly, like light pressed into the lining of my skin until the moment came when silence would no longer be enough and I would have to speak it aloud. The moment my feet touched American soil again, I felt it, the soft collapse of something I hadn't even realized I'd been holding open. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was quiet like the fading of a light, only I could see the dimming of a frequency I had been tuned to for what felt like lifetimes in the space of just a few days. The airport was loud, fluorescent, filled with people pulling suitcases and chewing gum, scrolling through phones and moving too fast to feel their own breath. But I was slow, not out of confusion, but reverence. I moved like someone returning from orbit, like gravity had to be relearned. My mother waved from behind the security barrier, her smile familiar, her eyes shining with relief. But I didn't run to her. I walked. I measured each step, not because I wasn't glad to see her, but because every motion now carried a strange, sacred weight. At home, nothing had changed. My room was exactly as I had left it. The books still lined the shelves in alphabetical order. The postcard from Portugal still clung to the wall above my desk. The dream catcher still hung in its silent loop over my bed. But I had changed, and suddenly the sameness of it all felt like a kind of quiet betrayal, as if the world expected me to slide back into my old shape without noticing that I no longer fit inside it. I sat on the edge of my bed, ran my fingers across the quilt, and tried to breathe in the familiarity. But all I felt was distance, not from this place, but from who I had been in it. My body was here, but my soul, it was still catching up. I didn't tell my mother what happened. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. How do you explain to someone that you left your body, met the essence of everything, felt more whole than you ever had in life, and then came back not because you were forced to, but because something deeper inside you whispered yes? How do you reduce that to sentences without slicing away its truth? I wasn't afraid she wouldn't believe me. I was afraid that words would betray what I had been entrusted with, and so I held it. Not as a secret, but as something sacred. Something that asked not to be explained, but lived. The days moved forward, carrying me with them. School homework, phone calls, family dinners. I went through the motions, but I was no longer moving from the outside in. I was navigating from the inside out. I heard teachers speak, but their words felt like static, barely brushing the edges of my awareness. Friends texted, asked how the trip was, told me I seemed different. I smiled, nodded, gave the answers they expected. But inside, I was listening to something else. Something slower, something older. A silence that never left me. A current of presence that pulsed beneath everything I touched. I began walking more, alone, not to escape, but to attune. I'd wander down forest trails, through abandoned parking lots, along cracked sidewalks where weeds pushed through like stubborn miracles. I wasn't looking for anything. I was listening. And in the listening, I started to feel it again, not as a vision or a voice, but as a pressure in the air, a soft shimmer behind the veil of ordinary things. I'd sit on benches and watch strangers pass by, and sometimes, just sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse. The way a person's shoulder slumped beneath invisible weight. The way someone hesitated before smiling like their joy was something fragile they weren't sure they were allowed to offer. I saw through them, not in judgment, but in recognition. I didn't need to know their stories. I could feel their ache. And maybe, just maybe, they could feel mine. One afternoon, walking along the edge of town, I noticed a narrow path I'd never seen before. It was marked by a rusted sign, bent and barely legible. The trees parted just enough to offer a choice. I didn't hesitate. My feet knew before my mind caught up. The trail led into a clearing, quiet and unremarkable, just a circle of trees, a fallen log, some dappled light filtering through branches above. But the air was different there, charged, alive, like the space had been waiting for me. I sat on the log, closed my eyes, and let the silence settle around me. I wasn't searching, I was remembering. And in that stillness, the question finally rose, not from fear, but from honesty. Why had I come back? I hadn't let myself ask it before. I was afraid the answer would shatter me, but here in this quiet pocket of earth and breath, I allowed it. Why me? Why return when that place held everything I had ever longed for? And then the response came, not in words, not in sound, but in awareness. Because you remembered, because you're ready, because now you see. I opened my eyes and the world looked the same, but I knew it wasn't. Not to me, not anymore. From that day on, I stopped waiting for the presence to return as it had in the White Realm. I stopped hoping for signs in the sky. Instead, I started noticing the sacred in what was already here, the way sunlight rested on water, the hush before a storm, the exact moment a breeze shifts direction. I didn't need more proof. Life itself had become the continuation of that near-death experience. Every leaf, every silence, every laugh that cracked open a long-held grief, all of it was part of the same remembering. I still didn't know what I was meant to do. I didn't need to. That was the gift the presence had given me, not answers, but a compass. One that pointed inward, one that guided by quiet. I wasn't here to escape life. I wasn't here to transcend. I was here to witness, to feel, to carry the echo of what I had seen into places where others had forgotten. And so I walked back home, not toward a purpose, but into a life where presence would become my purpose. And though the path ahead was still shrouded in mist, I wasn't afraid, because I had remembered the light beneath the ordinary. And that remembering would be enough. Weeks passed, and to anyone watching, I was just Isla again. Same face, same voice, same routines. I got out of bed, I went to school. I answered questions with just enough precision to keep people from wondering. But inside, a second life was unfolding, quiet, slow, unshakable. It didn't move like time moves. It pulsed beneath it. I wasn't living two lives. I was living one, but from two layers of reality, like standing in the same room, but seeing it in two dimensions at once. On the surface, I was the girl who had just come back from Portugal with stories I didn't feel like telling. Beneath that, I was a soul still echoing with the silence of the white realm, the memory of the presence, the knowing that I had not imagined what happened to me. It had happened. The near-death experience didn't fade like a dream. It stayed, but not like a movie replaying in my mind. It stayed as a lens, a subtle shift in perception that made even the ordinary ache with meaning. I didn't talk about it, not because I didn't want to share, but because language was still too heavy for it. Words felt like trying to pour starlight into a jar. Too much would be lost. I tried once briefly to mention it to an old friend over coffee. She laughed too quickly, nodded too eagerly, and changed the subject like she was brushing off dust. I realized then that the story wasn't ready, or maybe the world wasn't. And that was okay. Not everything sacred needs to be spoken. Some things ask only to be lived. I began to notice strange shifts in how the world responded to me. Streetlights turned green just as I stepped forward. Books I hadn't searched for appeared in my path. Strangers said things that echoed thoughts I hadn't spoken aloud. It wasn't magical in the Hollywood sense, it was subtle. Like the universe had grown more precise. Like it had always been this alive, this aware, and I had only just begun to notice. I remember one moment clearly. I was riding a city bus alone, and an old man beside me turned and said out of nowhere, "Sometimes the dead stay close, not because they're trapped, but because they love too much to leave." He didn't wait for a response. He just nodded as if he'd handed me a key I'd already been carrying. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. My whole body recognized the truth in it. My dreams changed too. They stopped feeling like fiction and began to feel like transmissions. Some were filled with symbols, doors opening into light oceans with no bottom stars that pulse like heartbeats. Others felt like memories that weren't mine. Lives I hadn't lived or maybe had in some form I could no longer deny. I'd wake up exhausted, not from lack of rest, but from how far I'd traveled. My soul was busy at night, not wandering, remembering. But I wasn't broken, I wasn't lost, I was becoming. Becoming someone who no longer needed proof, who didn't chase signs because life itself had become the sign. I didn't need to speak to be present. I didn't need to explain to be understood. I began to understand people differently too. Not through what they said, but through what lived behind their eyes. I could feel when someone carried sorrow like a weight strapped to their chest. I could feel when someone's smile was too thin to hold the truth. I didn't ask questions. I didn't offer advice. I simply stayed. And sometimes that was enough. I remember one day in particular. A friend hugged me tightly, said nothing, but I could feel the river of grief flowing through her rib cage. "I'm fine," she whispered. I didn't correct her. I just held her longer. That was something the presence had taught me. Real love doesn't need to fix. It just needs to witness. And I had become a witness. Not to drama or tragedy, but to the quiet places people tried to hide. I saw them. I honored them. I didn't speak unless the space asked me to. At school, I walked through hallways like someone walking through a forest of energy. Everyone glowing, flickering, buzzing with their own unfinished stories. Teachers still taught like nothing had changed, but I could see the tired child still living behind their eyes. Students still joked and fought and studied, but their auras told a different tale, some bright with hunger, some muted with fear. I wasn't better than them, just more awake. I didn't judge, I just saw. And the more I saw, the quieter I became. Silence wasn't absence anymore. It was invitation. One morning, sitting by my window, I watched the snow fall with a kind of reverence I'd never felt before. The flakes weren't cold to me. They were soft messengers. The air between them hummed, and in that space, a new question began to rise. It didn't come from my mind. It came from deeper. What now I had seen beyond life? I had touched eternity. I had returned. But for what the presence had never given me a map. It had given me something more subtle and far more demanding, a compass. And its needle pointed inward. It asked for stillness, for attention. And when I gave it, that a vision rose, simple, quiet, undeniable. I saw myself holding the hand of someone who was dying. I wasn't saving them. I wasn't stopping the inevitable. I was simply with them, present, fully, a mirror, a lighthouse, a quiet anchor in the most sacred crossing. And I felt it not as ambition, not as duty, but as alignment. Something in me whispered yes. I didn't know when. I didn't know how, but I knew. That was part of why I had returned, not to teach, not to impress, but to be. To be there for those standing at the edge of breath so they wouldn't feel alone in the crossing. That image didn't scare me. It honored me. It reminded me that I wasn't here to explain what comes after. I was here to embody what I had seen there, with presence, with reverence, with silence that could speak more than words ever could. So I stood from my window, exhaled slowly, and returned to the rhythm of my life, not to escape the mystery, but to weave it into every small moment. A glance, a step, a breath. I no longer feared forgetting, because once you've touched what lives beneath form, it never truly leaves you. It becomes the way you walk, the way you listen, the way you love, because I had died once. And in that dying, I had begun truly to live. The first time I stepped into a hospital, after everything, my breath caught in a way that surprised me. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anxiety. It was memory. Cellular, spiritual, like some forgotten part of me remembered corridors like these, the way the walls seemed to hum with the weight of unanswered prayers, the way time folds strangely in places where life and death meet in such close proximity. I wasn't there for myself. I was just accompanying a friend visiting her grandfather, but the moment those automatic glass doors slid open and that sterile scent hit my skin, I felt the invisible line again, the one I had crossed and returned from. That near-death experience hadn't just given me a story. It had given me a frequency, a kind of tuning that made me feel vibrations others didn't seem to notice. And in that moment, I felt it clearly. This place was not just where bodies were treated. It was where souls trembled at the edge. We rode the elevator in silence. My friend clutched a bag of snacks and crossword books, the kind of human offerings we bring to those we love when we can't bring solutions. I watched the numbers change, but my attention was somewhere else. The walls of the elevator seemed to breathe, or maybe it was me. I didn't know how to explain it, but the closer we got to that floor, the thinner the veil felt. Like something ancient was stirring, brushing against my skin in whispers only I could hear. When we entered the room, the man in the bed looked so still I thought we were too late. But then his eyelids fluttered and his breath caught the light just barely. Machines beeped in a slow rhythm. Tubes and tape and faded blue linens framed his fragile shape. My friend smiled too wide and began chatting softly, filling the room with words meant to distract from the silence between them. I stood back near the window, watching the city lights pulse beyond the glass, and then I turned back to him, and it happened. His eyes opened and they met mine, and in that instant I felt it again. That presence, that knowing. It was like looking at someone not from across a room, but from across eternity. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Something passed between us, something I didn't expect to find in a hospital room on a rainy Tuesday. Recognition. He blinked once slowly, like someone acknowledging not just a moment, but a memory. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It wasn't fascination. It was reverence. And then I felt it rising around him like mist, like music without sound. The threshold. He was close, not afraid, not resisting, just close. And I remembered what I'd seen, that light, that stillness, that presence that greeted me not as a judge, but as a mirror. And suddenly I knew why I was here, not just in that room, on this earth. I had returned to stand at these edges, to hold space, not with answers, but with presence. I didn't move toward him. I didn't reach out. I just stayed. And in that stillness, I felt him relax. His shoulders sank just slightly. His breath deepened, not because I'd healed him, but because I hadn't looked away. Afterward, my friend thanked me for coming, said nothing about the moment. Maybe she hadn't felt it. Maybe it wasn't meant for her. Maybe it was only for me. But when I stepped outside, the wind hit different, softer, like it carried an understanding. I had touched the edge again, not through my own dying, but through bearing silent witness to someone else's nearing. And it didn't scare me. It moved me. It reminded me. The near-death experience hadn't ended when I returned. It had opened a door that would never fully close. Not for me. I began noticing other thresholds, not just around death, but around choice, around truth. The moments when people stood on the verge of becoming, sometimes without knowing it. I'd see it in their hesitation, in the catch in their breath, before they said something they'd buried for years, in the way their hands shook when touching an old photograph, in the silence that came after the words. I never told anyone this before, and I learned to lean in, to hold those moments gently, to treat them as sacred crossings, because they were. Not all resurrections require the body to stop. Some happen while we're still standing. Some happen in bathrooms and bedrooms and long walks home from nowhere in particular. And when they do, if someone is there to witness it, to say, yes, I see you, I honor this, it changes something. It anchors it. I wasn't a healer. I wasn't a guide. I was a remembering in human form. And slowly, I stopped resisting that. I stopped apologizing for my softness, for my quiet, for the way I sometimes paused too long before speaking. I understood now it wasn't hesitation. It was listening, and not just to people, to the invisible, to the layers beneath the obvious. I began to live not from urgency, but from alignment. I didn't need to fix others. I needed only to be true to what I had seen. The rest would ripple in ways I couldn't control, and no longer needed to. Sometimes late at night, I'd sit on my porch with a blanket around my shoulders and look up at the stars, not to wish, but to remember that I had come from there, that I had seen beyond this skin, this story, this short span we call a life, and that one day I would return again, not with fear, but with the same gentle exhale that had carried me back into this body the first time. Until then, I would stay. I would walk slowly. I would speak kindly. I would hold the thresholds with reverence. Because life I had come to see was full of them. Birth, loss, forgiveness, grief, joy so deep it rearranged you. Every one of them a doorway. Every one a whisper from the presence, remember me. And I did, I do, in every step, in every silence, in every heartbeat. There are some truths that don't arrive in words, they arrive in frequencies. You don't learn them. You begin to vibrate with them. That's how the silence felt after my return, not as absence, but as music too fine for the ears. At first, I didn't know what to do with it. I mistook it for loneliness, the kind of stillness that filled my bedroom, the way it wrapped around me while everyone else rushed toward deadlines and dopamine felt too big to carry in this small human form. But then I realized it wasn't mine to carry. It was mine to let move through me. I was no longer meant to chase the noise of the world. I was meant to become a resonance chamber for the quiet truths the world had forgotten how to hear. I started noticing moments when the stillness spoke loudest. It wasn't during meditation or prayer, it was between things, between sentences, between breaths, between moments when someone said they were fine and the way their eyes wavered when they thought no one was looking. That's when I heard it most, the sound beneath silence. It felt like light but slower, like compassion that didn't need to be earned. I began sitting with people differently. I stopped waiting for the right thing to say and began honoring the space where nothing needed to be said. That I learned is where the real healing begins, in the unspoken spaces that most of us rush past because we fear they might swallow us whole. But I no longer feared the emptiness. I had been to the center of it. I had seen what it truly held. I remember sitting in the library one afternoon, sunlight drifting through the tall windows, dust floating like tiny galaxies in the air. A girl I barely knew sat across from me, eyes red, hands trembling slightly as she tried to focus on an assignment. I didn't ask what was wrong. I just reached out slowly and placed a piece of chocolate beside her notebook. She looked up, startled at first, then softened. She didn't speak, but her breath shifted. I felt it, the threshold moment, the subtle shift when someone feels seen without being interrogated. That was enough. I left before she could thank me. It wasn't about the gesture, it was about the silence between us that had been honored. More and more, I began to trust the pull of these invisible threads. Sometimes I'd walk into a bookstore and feel drawn to a particular title. I wouldn't always know why, but it would end up containing a sentence that cracked open something I hadn't known I needed to remember. Or I'd take a different route home, led by nothing but a feeling, and encounter someone I hadn't seen in years. Someone who just needed to cry to be reminded they were not alone. I didn't force any of it. I just followed. It was like being guided by a compass made of intuition, one gifted to me when I returned from the other side. The near-death experience had tuned me differently, and the world around me responded to that frequency. I was no longer just Isla, I was a vessel. Not for grand revelations, but for tiny realignments, the kind that ripple quietly and reshape everything. There were days when I doubted it. Days when I felt foolish, overly sensitive, too quiet in a world that praised volume. But then something would remind me, a leaf falling exactly when I looked up a stranger's words, echoing a thought I hadn't dared speak aloud, the sudden stillness of a room when I entered, and I would remember I was not imagining this. I was participating in something that lived beneath the obvious, and it was alive, aware, responsive. The presence I had met during my death hadn't vanished. It was here, woven into all of this, waiting for us to notice. I started writing again. Not essays or diary entries, fragments, sentences that arrived whole. I never edited them. They came like transmissions, soft, complete. Sometimes they made no logical sense, but they stirred something in me. Things like, the soul speaks in images, not arguments. Or, you are not lost, you are becoming vast. I'd write them on scraps of paper, tuck them into books, leave them in places strangers might find. Not because I needed recognition, but because I knew someone somewhere would read one at the exact moment they needed to. That was how the presence worked. Quietly, precisely. One night, lying in bed with the lights off and the window open to let the night air in, I felt something shift inside me. Not pain, not fear, a release. Like some final resistance I hadn't known I was holding had finally dissolved. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just lay there, eyes open to the dark ceiling, breathing slowly, feeling something rise from the center of my chest that wasn't emotion or thought, but memory. And then I heard it, not with my ears, but with whatever part of me still remembered the white light. A sentence, clear, gentle, final. Now you understand you are not here to shine. You are here to reflect. I smiled even though no one could see it. I understood now. I had always thought I was supposed to do something grand with what I'd experienced, to build it into a mission, a message, a movement. But it was simpler than that. I wasn't the flame. I was the mirror. My task was not to convince others of the light. It was to stay clear enough, still enough, true enough that when they looked at me, they might see a glimmer of it reflected back in their own eyes. That changed everything. I no longer needed to explain what had happened to me. I no longer needed anyone to validate it. The near-death experience wasn't a badge to wear or a story to sell. It was a remembering to live, to listen, to notice. And in doing so, to become a quiet doorway, others might pass through not even knowing they had crossed into something more spacious, more real, more sacred. That's who I had become, not someone with a message, but someone who lives as the message itself. Quietly, unshakably, light beneath skin, silence beneath words, a thread between worlds. There's a moment each morning just before waking when the veil is still thin. The body hasn't fully returned to its weight. The mind hasn't yet filled with names and plans and to-do lists. It's the space in between, a hush before the world begins again. I began to cherish that moment more than anything. In it, I could feel the pulse of what I had seen, the shimmer of the white realm beneath the skin of my dreams. Not always clearly, not always vividly, but enough. Enough to remember. Enough to remind me that I had not imagined it, that my near-death experience had not been a break from reality, but a return to it. The rest of the world might call this waking, but for me, it had become the dream, the illusion, the play, and I was walking through it now, not as someone trying to win or even survive, but as someone trying to remember, to feel, to carry the sacred into the mundane and hold it there without flinching. I noticed how often people walked around dimmed, as if some invisible hand had been gently turning the dial down on their inner brightness. Not all at once. slowly, with every disappointment, every betrayal, every time they were told to stop crying to toughen up to be realistic. You could see it in their posture, their pace, their voices. They didn't mean to forget who they were. The forgetting was taught, passed down like an inheritance no one ever asked for. I wanted to shake them sometimes, not out of anger, but urgency. I wanted to say, you are not this exhaustion. You are not this tightness in your chest. You are not just a body in a timeline. You are light pretending to be heavy. But I didn't say anything. I couldn't, not yet. So instead, I practiced seeing people as they were before they forgot. I'd look at the woman behind the grocery counter and imagine the little girl inside her who once believed in magic. I'd pass the tired man in the parking lot and wonder what dreams he gave up so he could be strong for someone else. I'd look at my own reflection and try to see past the skin into the glow I knew still lived underneath. Some days I could find it easily. Other days I'd reach and come up with silence, and I learned to be gentle on those days. Because even the sun has seasons where it hides. I didn't know if anyone else could feel what I felt. Maybe some did and just didn't speak of it. Maybe others were brushing up against it and dismissing it as coincidence. But I began to believe that we all carry the memory. That every act of kindness, every unexplainable tear, every time someone looks up at the sky for no reason at all, that's the remembering trying to surface. It doesn't need to shout. It just needs us to pause long enough to hear it whisper. That whisper has been the thread I follow now. I don't chase visions. I don't need divine interventions. The divine is already intervening in every breath, every heartbeat. Every moment we choose presence over panic, softness over survival. One afternoon, I walked into a chapel I'd never noticed before, tucked between two buildings downtown. It was empty, quiet, dusty air held in stained glass light. I didn't kneel. I didn't pray. I just sat. And as I sat, I felt it rise not from above, but from within. That same presence I had met during death, the one that didn't wear a face but knew me better than anyone ever had. It filled the room without moving. It spoke without sound. And all I heard was this thank you for staying. I don't know how long I cried, not because I was sad, but because I understood what it meant. Staying is not passive. Staying takes courage. To stay in this world after touching what lives beyond it. To walk among those still sleeping without screaming, to carry the light without needing to be seen. This is not easy. It is sacred. And in that moment, I knew I had not failed my task by being silent. I had honored it. The presence wasn't asking me to speak. It was asking me to live as proof, to walk as an invitation. So I did. I began to move through life as though everything was made of light-wearing form. Because it was. I treated conversations like rituals, eye contact like communion. I let go of the need to be understood and held tighter to the vow of understanding. Not intellectually, but soulfully. The way trees understand wind, the way oceans understand moonlight, without needing to explain. I still had bad days, still forgot sometimes, still got frustrated, still doubted. But I always returned, not to an idea, but to the knowing, the one carved into my being when I crossed over and came back. It doesn't matter how long I go without touching it, it never punishes, it just waits, like a lighthouse, like breath, like the soul that lives in all things, patient and persistent and endlessly kind. There was one evening sitting on my porch when I saw a child run down the street laughing arms wide, head back, the sound of joy echoing through the dusk. And I realized that's what we are underneath it all. That joy, that freedom, that light. Somewhere along the way, most of us forget. But the forgetting is not forever. The light is never gone. It just waits beneath the noise. And if you get quiet enough, still enough, honest enough, it will rise again. Just like it did for me. Because no matter how far we drift, no matter how heavy the world becomes, we are always only one breath away from remembering who we really are. Sometimes I wonder if I ever really came back. I mean, yes, my body returned. I walk, I eat, I talk to people about their day. I pass mirrors and see a reflection. But the girl I was before that near-death experience, the one who thought reality was made of skin and clocks and achievement, she never fully returned. She dissolved somewhere in the light, and what replaced her was something softer, wider, older. I didn't come back with a mission stamped on my forehead. I didn't receive angelic instructions or cosmic blueprints. What I came back with was a deeper silence, one that doesn't beg to be filled, one that teaches by presence alone. It's hard to explain what that does to you, to hold that kind of knowing and live in a world that keeps asking you to forget. Every billboard, every news cycle, every casual conversation about likes and deadlines, it all feels like an invitation to fall asleep again. But I had tasted something too alive, too vast, too true. And once you've seen through the veil, you can't unsee it. You walk with it, you breathe it. Even when you're exhausted, even when you feel small again, the remembering doesn't leave you. It just hums beneath everything waiting. I began noticing how many people were asking the same silent question I had once asked without words, without awareness. You could see it in their eyes, in their restless hands, in the way they filled their schedules until they forgot they were souls. They weren't bad people, just lost in the performance, just waiting for something to break the trance. I didn't want to wake them up by shaking them. I wanted to remind them by being a mirror, not the kind that reflects their masks, but the kind that reflects their light even when they've forgotten it's there. Sometimes that meant sitting beside someone in grief and saying nothing. Sometimes it meant offering a single sentence that cut through years of noise. And sometimes it meant walking away so they could find their own stillness. I stopped trying to be understood. I started trying to be clear. The more I let go of needing to explain myself, the more the world began to speak back in symbols. A feather on a day I asked for a sign. A child repeating the exact sentence I had dreamed the night before. A sudden breeze at the moment I was about to give up on everything. These were not coincidences. They were reminders, echoes. The presence hadn't left me behind. It had infused everything. It was in the stranger's eyes, the silence between songs, the way shadows moved across the floor like slow waves. I began to understand that the return was not a one-time thing. It was a continuous movement, a rhythm. I was not here to visit the divine once and then resume my life. I was here to keep returning every day, every breath, every choice, not to the afterlife, but to life itself. Because the truth is, most of us aren't really alive. We're performing aliveness. We're acting out scripts written by fear, by history, by hunger for validation. But there is a different way to be here, a truer way. It doesn't demand grand gestures. It demands presence. It demands honesty. It demands we feel everything, not just the joys, but the aches, the longing, the emptiness too. Especially the emptiness, because in that emptiness is where the light finds room to return. I began journaling not to record my thoughts, but to unravel them, to pour out the noise so the signal could be heard. And in those pages, I found a thread, one sentence that kept writing itself. Let the world be changed by your presence, not your perfection. That line stayed with me. I repeated it to myself in grocery aisles and traffic in moments of doubt. It gave me permission to stop striving, to stop pretending, to just be open, porous, imperfect, and deeply true. I think a part of me once believed that a near-death experience was supposed to make you special. But it doesn't. It just makes you real. It strips away the illusions you didn't know you were clinging to. It shows you what matters not in theory, but in sensation, in contrast, in unbearable softness. You return to your life not with superiority, but with humility, because you see it now how delicate it all is, how precious, how quickly it can be gone. And that's the quiet gift, the one no one really talks about. The way everything becomes more vivid, the taste of water, the way light spills through blinds, the curve of a loved one's shoulder as they sleep. It all pulses with meaning now, not loud, but undeniable. And in those moments, I realize I don't need to change the world. I just need to be awake inside it. I've come to believe that we're all standing on a threshold every moment of our lives, between forgetting and remembering, between rushing and resting, between pretending and presence. The near-death experience didn't give me all the answers. It gave me better questions, and the patience to let them echo inside me without demanding they resolve. Sometimes I still wonder why I was allowed to see, why I got to touch that light and others did not, or at least not yet. But I no longer chase that question with urgency. I let it sit beside me like a silent friend. Maybe the reason doesn't matter. Maybe it's not about why me. Maybe it's about what now. What will I do with the knowing? How will I move through a world still half asleep, carrying a memory of the sacred in everything? I think the answer is this: gently. I will walk gently. I will speak with intention. I will look for the light in others when they forget it in themselves. I will be soft in places that have been hardened by pain. I will forgive more quickly. I will hold sorrow like a teacher, not an enemy. And when the time comes for me to cross the threshold again, not through accident but through finality, I will not fear it, because I have already been there. And I know now death is not the end. It is the remembering. It is the homecoming. It is the soft return to everything we never stop being. And until then, I stay, with open eyes, with a quiet heart, with light leaking out from under my skin, not trying to be divine, just trying not to forget that I already am. Sometimes in the quietest hours of the night, I still ask myself if it really happened. Not because I doubt it. No, never that. But because the world around me continues to move as if nothing ever did. The clocks keep ticking. The lights keep changing. People keep rushing toward things they can't name, afraid of stopping long enough to hear what their own souls are whispering. And I too walk among them now, not as someone different on the outside, but as someone who carries a light most don't know how to name. A quiet certainty, a memory that stretches beyond birth, beyond breath, beyond death. The truth is, the further I travel from that moment when my heart paused and the veil between worlds thinned, the closer I feel to it. Not in flashes, not in dramatic realizations, but in the way the wind speaks when it brushes through the trees. In the pause between someone's words when they almost say what they really feel. In the stillness, I now see shimmering behind even the most chaotic eyes. My near-death experience didn't give me visions to chase. It gave me permission to see what was already here, to finally notice life in its rawest, most sacred form. I used to think we were here to accomplish something great, to leave a mark, to become unforgettable. But what if we're not here to be remembered by the world, but to remember ourselves? What if the point was never fame but presence, never success but softness? What if the real journey is the slow unraveling of everything we were told we had to be, until all that's left is the soul we've always been? Since coming back, I've begun to feel time differently. Not as a straight line, but as something that loops and folds and hums. Some moments feel infinite, others vanish before they land. And through it all, there's this quiet thread of knowing that guides me not in grand decisions, but in the smallest choices: how I speak to a stranger, how I listen to a friend, how I meet my own pain with tenderness instead of shame. These are the places where the sacred lives now, not just in churches or sunsets or silent prayers, but in the in-between, the overlooked, the forgotten spaces. I still cry sometimes for no clear reason. A certain song, a moment of beauty so unbearable, I can't contain it, the ache of recognizing someone's sorrow as if it were my own. But I don't fear those tears anymore. I welcome them, because each one is proof that I'm still open, still remembering, still connected to the part of me that never really left that white realm of silence and light. I've stopped looking for certainty. I no longer need to explain what I saw or even fully understand it. What I carry now isn't a message to convince others. It's a frequency, a way of walking in the world that invites others to slow down, to look again, to soften into the mystery rather than run from it. I don't lead with knowledge. I lead with presence. And sometimes that's enough. I know that some people might never understand. They might hear my story and dismiss it or twist it into something more digestible, more linear. That used to scare me. I used to think I had to defend the experience, make it logical, make it neat. But now I understand this isn't something to explain. It's something to embody. And the people who are meant to feel it will. Sometimes I wonder who I would have become if I hadn't died that day. If I hadn't seen the veil lift, hadn't heard the silence behind the stars, I think I would have lived a very normal life. And maybe I still do in many ways. But there's nothing ordinary about the way I breathe now. Nothing ordinary about the way I see someone's pain and don't flinch, or the way I hold space for someone who doesn't know how to name what they're feeling. I live a quiet life, but it's full, not of things, of light. I don't know what comes next, and I no longer need to. The presence I met in death never told me what to do. It only reminded me who I am, and that remembering has become my compass. I follow what feels true, what feels aligned. What feels like love, not the dramatic, performative kind, but the deep, patient, unshakable kind that waits behind every moment, asking only to be seen. And maybe that's all we're really here to do. To see, to truly see. Ourselves, each other. The light hidden beneath the dust of our stories and our wounds. We're not broken. We're layered. We're not lost. We're just buried under years of forgetting, but the soul never forgets. It waits, it whispers, it calls. And sometimes if we're lucky, or if we're broken open enough, we remember. I remember, not just the light I saw, but the light I am, the light we all are. And if nothing else, let this story be a mirror, a reminder. You do not have to die to begin again. You do not have to lose everything to remember what was never gone. You only have to pause, breathe, listen, and the remembering will begin. That was the near-death experience of Isla Monroe, a young woman who didn't just survive death, but returned, awakened, transformed, and deeply alive. Her story isn't just a message about what lies beyond, it's a call to live differently right here, right now. A reminder that presence is power, that stillness is not emptiness, and that the light we seek is often the light we've forgotten we already carry within. If this story moved something in you, if it stirred a memory, a question, or even just a breath of stillness, consider that a sign. Not from us, but from within you. A sign that maybe it's time to pause, to soften, to remember. And if you'd like to walk this journey with us through more stories that heal, awaken, and inspire, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share this message with someone who needs it. You never know whose soul is waiting to remember. Until next time, stay present, stay open, and stay connected to the light you are.